Come, let's make sense of the SANGH Parivar's anti-minority hatred. Swagatham, welcome. Of late, there have been a series of targeted attacks on Christians in the context of celebrating Christmas, which is considered a universal festival. Of all the religious festivals, the one festival that used to evoke the least allergy in the Indian context and anywhere in the world was the Christmas festival. And surprisingly, perhaps not so surprisingly, that has now become the context for unleashing systematic, orchestrated, deliberately targeted violence in order to attain a very, very clear political gain in the present context. I have seen quite a few discussions on various channels on this issue. And I saw those discussions in order to see if those discussions actually touch the real heart of the matter. I have to say that none of them did. Therefore, I decided to do a series of 2 or 3 short videos in order to provide an appropriate context for understanding this very unfortunate development. So, I have to state, in the interest of honesty right at the outset, that this series of videos are meant only for those who have an interest that goes beyond shallow journalistic interest. When I respond to issues and developments, I am not so much interested in the sensationalism of it as in the meaning of these events, and also as to what these events point to in terms of the continuing historical evolution of the human species. That is to say, and I don't want to hide it, I have a very clear philosophical interest in understanding, in decoding such events. So only those who want to understand this issue in a proper perspective, rather than people who are looking for something to tickle themselves with, need to see this video. I have to make it very clear at the outset. Now, how are we to understand this hatred and the hatred-induced violence against the Christian community in particular and religious minorities in general? When we say religious minorities in this context, we actually mean only 2 minority communities, the Muslims and Christians, because the Sangh has really no problem with the other 3 nationally designated minorities. Now, very clearly, if you want to understand this problem, you have to understand that this is an outworking of the caste mentality, the caste psyche. Now, here I'm going to give only 2 aspects. There are many aspects to this issue. I have to be brief, I have to be as precise as I can. Therefore, I'll give only 2 aspects of it. First of all, the caste system, as Max Weber argues in his very interesting small book title, small book, The Religion of India. I remember reading it about 30 years ago. In that tiny volume, Weber argues that of all systems ever invented by the genius of man, there is none that rivals the Indian caste system in freezing a society and equating social paralysis with stability. It says the one system that's hardest to influence, hardest to change, the one system that cannot tolerate any change, any mobility, any momentum is the caste system. And I think that's absolutely correct. And in order to understand the Sangh Parivar's allergy, particularly to the Christian community, we need to see it in the context of the caste mentality, and in particular this aspect of the caste system, that it is totally devoted to keeping a society frozen in the status quo. Please remember this, to keep the society frozen in the status quo. In other words, no change is acceptable and no change will be tolerated. So, the caste system misunderstands stability as immobility. Immobility. Whereas the logic of life is mobility. If you have the time and the patience, I would recommend Henrik Bergson's pace setting book that, that appeared, I think, in 1920, The Creative Evolution. The Creative Evolution. One of the main points that Bergson, the French philosopher, argues in that book is that the essence of life is momentum and mobility. The caste system has been deliberately designed to stigmatize, criminalize, and suppress mobility. So there is, if you accept Bergson's thesis at all, there's an anti-life logic already immanent in the caste system. These things are not clearly recognized. That's the reason why I'm taking a little time over it. I request you to have patience with me if you want to understand this problem in truth, rather than deal with it in a shallow journalistic fashion. Now, the Christian community is completely different from this. More than the Muslim community, the Christian community, by virtue of the spiritual dynamism of the biblical faith, is dedicated to bringing about change, dedicated to introducing the element of momentum into the social context, because that momentum is the hallmark of a living society. A society without mobility, a society without moment, a society without vitality is a dead society. And I have to argue, whether people like it or not, that it is because of this deadness that unfortunately and unwittingly, people injected into the veins of the Indian society via the caste system, that the great Indian people became slaves to foreign invasion and the resultant slavery for nearly 1,000 years. Now, the caste system is paradoxical in this. On the one hand, it paved the way for foreign invasion, and on the other hand, and that's a positive aspect of the caste system, even as the people of India were subjugated first by the Mughals and then by the British, the very same caste system enabled people to hold on to their core belief and their core identity. That's the paradox of the caste system. It's something at once worrisome and commendable. That's the paradox of the caste system. So, from our point of view, what we need to record in our memory is that the caste system commits a serious mistake in equating stability with immobility. A society that is fixed in immobility becomes anti-life, and resorting to violence or reposing one's total faith in violence is the foremost symptom of being anti-life. Violence is anti-life. On the face of it, the thinkers and the ringleaders of the Sangh Parivar might think that this is violence unleashed against groups of people they dislike. But violence is always a double-edged sword. This sword that you wield against others will return to you to cut your own throat. That's a lesson of history, and I don't think history lies in this respect. Today it is a set of people that you attack because they are powerless to defend themselves against you. Tomorrow, members of the same group will splinter, they'll fight among themselves. That is precisely the lesson of history. So, please understand, that is a terrible mistake. It is an anti-life logic to equate stability with immobility. And the particular problem that the Christian religion, the Christian religious community introduces into this caste context is that via conversion, I'm not going to say in this video much about my attitude or my outlook on conversion. I made my stand clear about 35 years ago. I have my own very clear stand on conversion. I'm not going to develop that thought here. The problem with conversion is there is custom designed to introduce momentum and mobility into this caste-ridden, immobilized, paralyzed society. In other words, conversion seems the most unforgivable crime from a social point of view, which is totally committed to the status quo, the preservation of the status quo. Conversion introduces unprecedented and unfamiliar dynamics, energy, mobility, and therefore unpredictability, instability into this very stagnant social order. The second problem with the caste system is that it is out and out hierarchical. The Brahmins at the top, the Kshatriyas below them, the Banyas, then the Shudras, then Atishudras, those who are outside the caste system, etc. So it's a very clear hierarchical order. One on top of the other. It's the secular counterpart of this is bureaucracy. So the caste system actually made the Hindu religion, Hindu community, bureaucratic. But again, that's a strand of thought I'm not going to pursue any further. So from the hierarchical point of view, certain sections of the society have a right that cannot be and should not be questioned, to dominate, to be ascendant over all the others. You cannot question the presumption of superiority on the part of a Brahmin on the basis that you are more educated than him, you have greater intellectual achievements than him or her. If you are a Shudra, you are a Shudra. You may be a Nobel laureate, but you are a Shudra even then, and therefore, from the caste perspective, you, a Dalit Nobel laureate, will always be inferior hierarchically to a Brahmin who may be either illiterate or hardly literate. That's the problem. The caste, it is hierarchical. Now, in order to understand the problem here, let's look away from India. Because when we look at the Indian situation from within India, we could be subjective. Let's look at a situation far away in time and space. Let's look at Greece. The Greek society was also hierarchical, but much less complicated as compared to us. The Greek society was split into two major blocks: the aristocrats, the elites, and the common man, the pedestrian, the common man, the common folk. Now, the Greeks believed that the aristocrats, the social, economic, political elite, the so-called citizens, they represented the soul of the nation, the soul. Whereas the masses represented the body. And from a hierarchical point of view, the soul, or in this context, let's say the head has every right to be ascendant over the body. And if the body says that, no, I'm equal to you, then it is rebellion, it is dangerous, it has to be suppressed. So, in the Greek context also, the aristocrats, the social elite, the political elite, they were granted an institutionalized right to be ascendant over the hoi polloi, the common man. And in order to secure this relationship, two virtues or two elements were used. It's very important to know this. One is fear and the other is obedience. The elite, the social, political, economic elite had every right to induce fear in the masses, which makes it easy to control them. They also had the right to expect implicit obedience from others. And now, if you look at the Indian context, if you look at the outlook, the mentality, the assumptions and presumptions of the Sangh Parivar, you'll find that it is exactly paralleled by it. In fact, the main practical purpose behind these episodes of orchestrated violence is to inject the Christian community with the poison of fear, because once the virus of fear invades them, infects them, they'll behave in a particular manner which is very convenient. In fact, fear is the most effective weapon against freedom. In order to curtail the freedom, the scope and range of freedom for a community, you don't have to amend the constitution. All you have to do is to fix them, paralyze them in the framework of fear, and then they will behave as a people who have no freedom, no right at all. The constitution becomes de facto null and void for them. So the usefulness of fear. The second, of course, is obedience. If the Sangh Parivar orders that Christians should not celebrate Christmas, or the Christians should not celebrate Christmas in this manner or that manner, you have to obey. You have no right to ask why. You have no right to get a reason for it. Because then obedience will not be implicit obedience. Implicit obedience means the right to extract obedience without making that the reason for it known. You don't have to convince somebody that that person has to obey you to make that obedience implicit. So irrationality necessarily goes with implicit obedience. Now, for example, for the sake of Christians, let me say this to you. In all the discussions that I have seen in the last 2 days, the main defense of the spokespersons of the Sangh Parivar, particularly the Vishuddha Parishad and the Bajrang Dal, has been that Christians are cutting the roots of Hinduism from India via their conversion. Now, I was amused when various people were trying to contradict that allegation. They were doing so because simply they had no understanding of the context. If you think that the Sangh Parivar spokespersons are making this allegation as a statement of fact, you got it completely wrong. You're downright stupid. Those who say this know that factually this is not right. Let me give you a personal experience. In some of my earlier videos, I made a reference to one of my best friends, Vishnu Hari Dalmaya, who used to live in 18 golf links, who was at that time the national president of Vishuddha Parishad. I had a very long argument with Vishnu Ji, as I used to call him. He started by saying that Christians are really creating problems for themselves and for us through their conversion. And when I sort of presented to him in a relationship of affection and mutual respect, you're free to tell the truth. So I told Vishnuji that if you look at the facts, the data available, the government data, you will find that the contrary is true. For example, in the 1961 census, Christians were about 3.6% of India's population. And by the time 2011 census came, it shrank to 2.18% of the population. In absolute numbers, Christians have increased, but in percentage terms, Christian community is actually shrinking. When I said this, he immediately agreed. He told me with a smile, he said, yes, we know, all of us know that this is the case. But we have data collected from the various dispatches sent from India by various Christian agencies making tall claims that this month we have converted so many Hindus, in the month of February so many, month of May so many, month of October so many. And if you go by those claims, massive conversions are taking place. But without my having to say anything at all, Vishnuji told me again with a very, very naughty smile. He said, we all know that these lists of the convertees is fraudulent and they are being sent abroad in order to collect money from naive, stupid white men. He told me this. So everybody knows that conversion is not such a big issue. So if you try to relate to or respond to this problem on the basis of facts, then you get nowhere. The real fact of the matter is that the Sangh Parivar needs an excuse. They need a means in order to meet a psychological need. And with that, I'll close this video. The rest of what I have to say, I'll include in the next video. As the thinkers at and around the freedom struggle of India all realize, the Hindu psyche carries a wound. The wound related to the historical experience of being subjugated by foreign overseas forces for about 1,000 years. And that reality breeds a psychological need, namely the need to dominate, the need to be ascendant over. After all, Hinduism is such a glorious faith, which it is. Its philosophical core is great. Not that its scriptural, theological, philosophical core is translated into popular religion, what's called folk religion, as against theological religion or philosophical religion. These are all very, very important distinctions. But again, for want of time, I'll not be able to dwell deep into those distinctions, which are all very important. Now, this faith and the people who practice this great faith had to live as second-class citizens or even as a subjugated people for 1,000 years. Obviously, this inflicted a very deep and unhealing wound in the Hindu psyche. And as a Christian living in India, I am in full sympathy with that. I understand it perfectly. Therefore, I have a very large margin of tolerant understanding about why these things are indulged in and the psychological factors working behind it. And therefore, I'm not particularly surprised, though I'm saddened, that it has come to this pass. It doesn't have to be, and it will not benefit anyone, particularly the perpetrators of this violence. So, the idea that Christians are alien, for example, in one of the films, one of the videos I saw, the representatives of Bajrang Dal catch hold of a Christian and ask him, your savior belongs to a country 22,000 miles away from here. Why do you believe in him? Why can't you believe in something here? So this allergy to something which is foreign. It is all right that a foreign lady is shown on the voters list in Haryana 22 times. That is okay. But if Christians have their savior who was born in another part of the world, then that's a big issue. I don't want to argue this point. What I'm saying is we must understand the psychology behind it. When psychology comes in, the factual amount goes to the background. We must understand the psychology rather than the factual matrix. So, the idea of the Sangh Parivar needs to keep the religious minorities, particularly the religious minorities that have their Punya Bhumi and Pidur Bhumi, away from the geographical limits of India, subjugated or in a state of obvious subjugation, arises from the fact that this has a very profound appeal to the Hindu psyche. Why? Because of the wound that lies hidden and unhealing in the Hindu psyche, which is of historical origin. I will not discount it. I respect it. I understand it most sympathetically. And therefore, all my strategies, all my advocacies in the past have been with reference to this compassionate understanding that I have, and also the common sense that very often Christians and Muslims fail to practice in this context. So in this video, all that I have tried to do is to portray or fix some kind of a context for understanding this phenomenon. My main argument has been that in order to understand this quite obviously gratuitous violence which is not explained by any practical gain or a practical purpose, gratuitous violence. In order to understand this violence, we have to see it in context, and that context is the caste system and the mentality or outlook that it breeds, which is both, I identified two aspects of the caste system. One, that it absolutizes stability and mistakes it for immobility, particularly social immobility. That's point number one. Point number two, the caste system is inherently and incorrigibly hierarchical. And from a hierarchical attitude, the higher section of the society has a right, in fact, the duty to keep the lower section subjugated in the interest of social stability, social order, social harmony. And unfortunately, Christians more than Muslims are problematic in this context because the Christian commitment to the duty to share the good news with people and to serve as a catalytic agent for their liberation and their reaffirmation introduces very strong elements of mobility into this immobilized social order, which is put in a caste, as it were. C-A-S-T also becomes C-A-S-T, put in a caste. And therefore, there is a head-on collision between the logic of the caste and the spiritual commitment of the Christian community. And I say this in order to request the leaders of the Christian community to engage with this idea and to understand the whole situation with some degree of historical realism as well as human compassion, and see if we can work out through dialogue a point of mutual understanding. I believe in dialogue. I believe in the resolution of problems via dialogue. And I believe that violence tries to fill the vacuum that results from the rejection of dialogue. The problem with the Christian community is that we don't have the confidence to engage with the majority community in a dialogue on these issues because, let's be honest, the Christian community has always been defensive about conversion. I've written a great deal about this. I'm totally convinced that even though we say that we are mandated to convert, etc., to make the good news reach the lives of people, if somebody really asks us a searching question about conversion, we would have nothing to say. So we are ourselves in a state of confusion or lack of conviction about what we are doing. And yet, we gloss over the fact that in this way, we activate extremely serious allergy, antipathy, hostility towards us. And it doesn't help that when these hostilities break out in the form of violence, physical violence, we go to a corner, sit there and cry. A mature and the only feasible response is to face the reality squarely, to be truthful and open about it, to listen to the other side. And if you have the courage and the preparation, enter into a dialogue based on truth, openness, and mutual respect, and see if a resolution can be arrived at, which I believe is possible. That will take preparation, that will take an unconventional way of approaching our problems and our situation. Unfortunately, Christians for centuries have been nurtured in this very illogical way of living confined to their own little enclaves, denying the world outside, as a result of which, unfortunately, the Christian community has not developed as yet the capacity to engage the world in dialogue. And therefore, events like this are also a loud reminder to us that this strategy is no longer feasible. We cannot live like religious islands, denying the rest of the world. We have to be with the world as much as we are in the world, and we have to be in dialogue with the world. After all, the core insight in the gospel, particularly the Gospel of John, is that God loves the world. And therefore, Christians cannot be allergic to the world. If we are allergic to the world will reciprocate in allergy, and that's precisely what is happening. In the next video, I propose to look a little more factually at the situation, but then more of that when the time comes. For the time being, I conclude, and I thank you for your patient attention.